Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Dorothy Sayers podcast. I'm Lindsay Scholl, and I'm glad you're here. I've called Sayers one of the leading English writers of the early 20th century, and it's true. In fact, I just read an article in the New Yorker that called her, quote, the godmother of feminist detective fiction, unquote. That was in 2019, so pretty recent. And when you consider that this group of feminist detective fiction writers includes Agatha Christie and P.D. James, that's remarkable praise indeed. But in the Dorothy Sayers podcast, as you probably noticed, I'm not going to talk so much about her detective fiction, simply because there's so much good stuff out there already. There's even another podcast called As My Whimsy Takes Me with Karis Ellison and Sharon Chu. But of course, we must and should talk about her as a writer. So today we're going to broaden out our view and talk about writing in general, what she said about how to do it well, and how she herself did it well. And hopefully in the midst of all this, we can improve our own writing. So let's get started on episode 3, Advice on Writing. The test of good writing is a simple one. If a sentence puzzles or startles you, pull it to pieces. If it is good writing, then the harder and the more closely you examine it, the more meaning it will yield. But if it tumbles to bits easily, if you find its syntax dislocated, its epithets imprecise, its meaning vague or contradictory, then it is bad and should be quickly thrown into the dustbin of oblivion. One should not keep rubbish lying about in the house of the mind. This from Sayers in her essay Plain English from the publication called The Unpopular Opinions, 1947. We're going to dive into that essay a little bit more later, but when I'm going to talk about writing today, and this talk is going to be divided into 2 parts, what she did well in writing, and then how she talked about writing. But first, last episode, I promised you a story about Dorothy Sayers, and I wrote this podcast material without thinking of stories, so I'd kind of forgotten. But I do want to give you one. In one of the letters, and one of the editions of letters that Barbara Reynolds collected for Sayers, she writes about this story. She wasn't there for this, but I guess the guy who was there for it told her about it. Reverend Auburn Moody was having lunch with Sayers and an actress, named Sybil Thorndike. And I don't know if he was having lunch with them or if he was just there in the restaurant. Anyway, he noticed that at one point, the restaurant had fallen very quiet. And what turns out is everybody had started listening to Sayers and Thorndike because the 2 ladies were so voluble and maybe loud, but also hopefully saying something worthwhile. Anyway, everybody had started eavesdropping on what these ladies were saying. And when they got up to leave, Sayers starts looking around saying, where's my hat? I can't find my hat. And it turns out she had been sitting on it. And so without further ado, she took the smushed hat, slapped it on her head, and walked out of the restaurant. So there you go. There's a little Sayers anecdote. Okay, back to writing. The first part, what she did, this is based on my own observations, but you don't have to scratch the surface very deep. If you're just paying attention to all when she's writing, you can see these things for yourself. And also, as a side note, for people who are writing, this is, if you're listening to this and you think, I'm just listening to this to support Lindsay or to learn about Sayers, I myself am not a writer. That's not true. Writing is a gift to all humanity. We're not born with it. Obviously, we have to develop it. But you do write at some times. You probably write emails. You probably write Facebook posts. And then, of course, you might be trying to write short stories or academic papers or so on and so forth. It's just fun to learn about. And even if you're not a writer, you're a reader. So I hope that you get something out of this, no matter where you are in your literary journey. Okay, so the most obvious thing that I think that she did well in her writing was the dialogue. She seems a master of dialogue that not only flows well and is sort of realistic, but it does other things as well. And primarily, it conveys action and description. And I want to read to you from one of her novels, called The Unpleasantness of the Bologna Club. This is just on the first page, so you don't have to worry about spoiler alerts. And I'm just going to read just a couple paragraphs exactly as she wrote it. What in the world, Whimsy, are you doing in this morgue? Demanded Captain Finneman, flinging aside the evening banner with the air of a man released from an irksome duty. Oh, I wouldn't call it that, retorted Whimsy amiably. Funeral parlor at the very least. Look at the marble. Look at the furnishings. Look at the palms and the chased bronze nude in the corner. Yes, and look at the corpses. Place always reminds me of that old thing in Punch, you know. Waiter, take away Lord What's-His-Name. He's been dead 2 days. Look at old Ormsby there, snoring like a hippopotamus. Look at my revered grandpa. Daughter's in here at 10 every morning, collects the Morning Post and the armchair by the fire, and becomes part of the furniture till the evening. Poor old devil. Suppose I'll be like that one of these days. I wish to God Jerry had put me out with the rest of them. What's the good of coming through for this sort of thing? What'll you have? Dry martini, said Whimsy. And you? I'll stop there. 1, it's fun reading. 2, think of what you learn from this dialogue. Now, this is all dialogue. The only bit of non-dialogue is where the captain flung aside his evening banner and with a certain air. Basically, everything else is dialogue. You learn that they are not in a morgue. They're not in a funeral parlor. They're in they're in a club where old retired gentlemen kind of hang out and read newspapers and stuff. You learn that old Ormsby is snoring like a hippopotamus. You learn that Fenneman has a grandfather, and he has a regular routine. Every morning he dodders in at 10. You learn that Fenneman was in the war because he wishes that Jerry, or a German, would have put him out of his misery. And then you learn that they're ordering a drink. Whimsy orders a dry martini, and so on and so forth. That's all dialogue. And there's something about it being conveyed through speech that seems to make for really smooth reading. Instead of the narrator saying, and Whimsy turned to the waiter and said, waiter, and told him that he would like a dry martini, you get it all in the flow. You pick it up naturally. I think that's one of her great strengths and something we could probably all can put in our writing to the extent that we write dialogue. Another point, and this is kind of a technical point, but I think it's worth mentioning. You know, have you ever heard of a dialogue tag? I think that's the right word. A dialogue tag is where it says somebody speaks and they say, said Whimsy, or John looked at the house and exclaimed, gosh, that needs painting. Or you get the idea. It's something that is like, she exclaimed, he cried, she lamented, he said, it, whatever. It's a tag that tells you who's speaking and kind of what the situation is. Now, where Sayers puts her tags, and this is a case here in Unpleasantness, and this is just the page that I'm looking at right now, and I look through Gaudy Night and there, and I think it's probably throughout her novels, she often puts a tag right after the first bit of speech that the character says. So, dry a martini, comma, said Whimsy. What in the world, Whimsy, are you doing in this morgue, comma, demanded Captain Fenneman. And if you look at, I was looking at this passage in Gaudy Night, and if you just look at the tags, it gets pretty repetitive. Like the tags themselves don't sustain anything. It says, said Beatrice, said, she said so-and-so, said so-and-so. It gets pretty repetitive. But somehow it works for the reader. When you're caught up in the flow of the story, I guess you get enough information to know who's saying what, but not enough to distract you from what they're saying. And as we've already discussed, what they're saying is important. It flows nicely, but also it conveys action, and it conveys character, and it conveys description. So where she puts those tags, it works pretty well for her. Another point about dialogue, so we have conveys actions, where she puts the tags. Another point is that she uses it a lot. She uses it in her regular correspondence. Of course, she's going to put dialogue in a novel. Everybody puts dialogue in a novel. But she just seems to have so much fun with it. I want to read to you this passage from, again, this is from her collection of letters. And this is volume 4. And she's writing to her friend, Barbara Reynolds. And she's talking about the, I got to find it here. Having a hard time finding it. Page 365. Heading on over to page 365. Okay. She's talking about a cat situation. And she says that this old, she calls him poor Papa, this stray Tom wandered in at 1 o'clock in the morning with all sorts of skin torn off of him, and she didn't know how to help him, and she basically could only give him food, and that was it. And he wandered out, disappeared. She feared the worst. He comes back in on Monday, turns up again about 7 p.m. Okay, and this is the story takes up from here. However, on Monday, he turned up again about 7 p.m., so I hastily shut him up in the kitchen with a plate of fish and rushed to the phone. Oh, Mrs. Walker, it's Miss Sayers. Is anybody by any chance available? Poor Papa's had a dreadful accident. I'm so afraid he'll go septic. Yes, John's in the surgery. Am I to take a message? Oh, good. Well, poor Papa. Parentheses, long sad story, listened to with little sympathetic cries. Hold on, I'll ask him. Parentheses, anxious pause. My husband says if you can keep the patient in the kitchen a little while longer, he'll be right round. Oh, yes, splendid. He's being good and quiet. Parentheses, and then a commentary on life where she talks about how the vet has a hard life with patients liable to vanish in every moment, and how surgeons, what would surgeons think if their patients just disappeared from the waiting room as soon as they get out there. Anyway, you see the dialogue, and there are so many examples of this in her letters where she takes just she could be saying, oh yeah, had a cat, he got injured, called the vet, they came around, he took care of it. But no, she kind of expands it out into this beautiful little scene. Okay, enough on that. So dialogue is good. She's also very intellectual in nature in her writing, and I'm even with the Peter Wimsey novels, which again they're not academic. She doesn't bother to translate little French or Latin or German idioms or passages. In fact, there's a short story where she has quite a bit of French that she doesn't bother to translate. Her detective, Peter Wimsey, quotes classic authors almost as second nature, and when we end up meeting Harriet Vane, she can return him quote for quote. And it's just all very, you could look at it and think, that is only for nerds. But her novels were really popular among regular readers. And one of the reasons is that, for the most part, you can get through the story and understand it and enjoy it without knowing French, which I don't, or knowing Latin or anything like that. But I think another one of its strengths is it shows that there's more going on in the characters' heads than just the plot in front of them. I think it shows a gateway into a world of philosophy or just art or just another way of thinking. You don't have to enter that world, but she's showing you that it's there, and she's showing it through her characters and often her dialogue. Okay, another strength, and let's see. I'm just so you, if you're keeping count. We dialogue, intellectual in nature, and then we got two more. One is everything can be personified, especially when she writes about cats. And there is this wonderful little passage where she's talking about, she's writing to a lady named Nora Lamburn, and she's talking about her cats. And this is what the letter says. She goes, "Dear Nora, yes, by all means. We, cats and self, shall be here all be here on Tuesday, and delighted to see you and Diana. We can go across and have a nice lunch at the Spread Eagle. We three, I mean, not the cats, where the food is very good. Sandra is hoping she may have something to show you, but we cannot quite be sure whether she will be ready by then. We have acquired a pensioner, a handsome black Tom, who comes meowing piteously and voraciously devours a pittance of bread and fish water. I have a horrible feeling that he intends to become a permanent visitor. I shall soon have to hang out a signboard. Cat's Paradise, board residence, on and off milk license, non-resident served, Maison Tolérée, proprietress Dorothy L. Sayers." Enough said on that. Anyway, keep in mind that this is really before, I don't know if she ever watched Disney. I don't know the history of Disney. But in my mind, talking animals equals Disney. And this is, it's just, Lewis did the same thing. They just love giving animals personalities. Of course, there's Wind in the Willows, too. I'm reading through that with my husband right now. And anyway, it's just fun. Love it. Okay, and another little tidbit here. She has this, there's this volume called A Matter of Eternity, which is just selection of writings from Dorothy Sayers. It's just excerpts, but at the end of it, there is this beautiful poem entitled For Timothy in the Coherence. Coherence, that's an idea by Charles Williams. We're going to leave that alone for now. First verse, first line, "Consider, O Lord, Timothy, thy servant's servant." She goes on, very last line. "When the ark of the new life grounds upon Ararat, grant us to carry into the rainbow's light, in a basket of gratitude, the small, milk-white, silken identity of Timothy, our cat." Yeah, love it. Okay, so she personifies things. Final point I'm going to make today is that everything can be made into a story. So you see this mostly in her letters. You can see it in the dialogue a little bit in Whimsy, but she imbues mundane things with a lovely significance and always enlightens everything up. And I guess that's kind of my, probably a better fourth point. Everything can be made into the story, but also she has a very lighthearted way, whimsical, actually, way of approaching life. Now, to be clear, she takes herself as a contracted writer very, very seriously, as we saw with the issue with Miss Jenkins. But she takes herself as a person not very seriously at all. At one point, she's talking about biographies and, I don't know, some sort of drawings or something, and she says, "I'm all head and no features, like a tadpole." She talks about, the situation with the cats and everything else. She's not making fun of it, but she's making light of a lot of different things. And in that, she's kind of in the tradition of G.K. Chesterton, I think. Okay, so what she said about writing, we talked about what I've noticed, and I'm sure other people have noticed. Now, the quote at the beginning of this podcast, was from an article entitled Plain English, and that is advice about writing. And there, in that article, she laments something called the telegraphese, which it has done to modern writing, which is kind of like trying to make sentences short, but using the wrong words and using over kind of bloated language. And she goes through various examples of overblown language versus clean language, participles running amok, conjunctions doing their job, and so on and so forth. And I read this article and I thought, this would be a good one to share on the podcast. And then I realized, no, this is a lousy one to share on the podcast because it's hard to convey orally. We'd have to we'd have to all remind ourselves what a participle is, what a conjunction is. And it'd be great for students, but I'm just going to leave it with that quote that I shared at the beginning about dissecting a sentence. And to my knowledge, she didn't write a lot about how to write well generally. So no Dorothy Sayers writing textbook. She has a lot to say, however, about different facets of writing. And some subtopics would be what we've already talked about, how to write about biblical things and spiritual things. She talks about how to put your ideas into your work, and she talks about rules for writing detective fiction. She has a lot of thoughts on translation and writing poetry, and those are so substantial that I'm actually going to leave those for another podcast. But let's talk about those three that I mentioned: biblical and spiritual things, how to put your ideas into work, and rules for writing detective fiction. And we'll finish with the detective fiction. So when she talks about writing biblical topics and for children, I think the main point that we want to get from her is her willingness to write over people's heads, which isn't usually considered a strength, but for her, she manages it. And she says that, quote, "It is far better to write a little over the heads of the youngest than insult the older ones with something that they think babyish." And she's talking about this broadcast, A Man Born to be King. And she had gotten a little bit of pushback about things that the kids may not understand. And she says, really, that's okay. You can have some mystery in there. In fact, when she's talking about one of the speeches from one of the wise men traditionally named Melchior, she says this: "The thing that they, children, react to and remember is not logical argument, but mystery and the queer beauty of melodious words. I don't suppose it would occur to you to put on hang on, let me get that quote. Let me get you the full quote right here. I started it and now I realize it. Here we go. Okay, but you are not children. The thing they react to and remember is not logical argument, but mystery and the queer beauty of melodious words." Okay. "I don't suppose it would occur to you to put on a reading of the Athanasian Creed as an attraction for the children's hour. Yet I know of a small boy of 7 who urgently demanded this of his mother as a special birthday treat. It is a language that stirs and excites." And then she goes on a little further and she says this. Okay. It is true that children may not grasp the implications of the imperial star and the constellation of the Virgin. Does that matter? If they hear and remember the words, one day they may suddenly light upon the meaning. Though actually some of the older ones may be a good deal better up in astrology than the rest of us, since the poor little wretches have to do, well, anyway, she goes on about education. But the important thing is the magical sound of the words, not what their brains make of it. And again, she's writing to young kids, and this is for the children's hour, youngish kids. And if you're familiar with her Lost Tools of Learning essay, she divides kind of ages into grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or the poll parrot stage, which younger kids, they don't know what it means. They don't need to know what it means, but they love the sound of it, and they can repeat and memorize quite a bit. And this is kind of along those lines, is that kids, especially, they have words wash over them that just sound cool. And they don't get all the implications, and that's fine. Remember, in her novels, even, she has these quotes from classical literature, and they have these passages of Latin or French, and it's a gateway into the world of intellectual possibilities. You don't have to enter, but again, at least you know it's there. Okay, a quick note that she said about putting philosophy into writing. So again, that was this last thing I quoted was from volume 2 of her letters, and I'm going to quote something else from volume 2 of her letters. She, as you noticed probably from episode 1, she does feel very strongly about writing what she believes. As far as she doesn't want to write something that she feels forced into writing, a statement that she feels forced into saying. At the same time, when she's writing novels, it's got to be a good novel. It's got to be a good story. That's the most important thing. If you just make something a platform, that's no good, and it's a death knell for a story. And she does say this: "It is, of course, quite true that ideas can't be violently imposed on people. In my novels, especially the last 2 or 3, I have tried to infiltrate a few general ideas, especially about the value of work and the absolute necessity for intellectual integrity. But as you understand so clearly, this kind of thing has to be done very carefully and must arise naturally out of the story. A story that has great gobbets of philosophy dumped into it very readily becomes unreadable." And so this is kind of her, this is the bridge between her novel writing and her life as kind of she was always a thinker, but her publications is thinking along particular lines. And I think it's pretty good advice if you're trying to write something, if you're trying to write a story, and you probably have a point to get across in the story, whether it's maybe an environmental point or your point. The story is the most important thing. But you can get across certain general ideas in it. It can have a message, but it's just got to be paired very carefully with the actual plot line. Okay, so we're going to end on slightly a lighter note. Her rules on writing detective fiction. In 1935, she delivered a lecture at Oxford entitled Aristotle on Detective Fiction. And I want to give you some highlights. Can't read the whole thing to you, of course, but I want to give you a couple of highlights that she gives her rules about writing detective fiction. And she was part of the Detection Society that was founded by G.K. Chesterton. And they had a ton of fun with it. Very whimsical. Okay, some of the criteria for writing a good detection story. And she says they're taken from Aristotle with a lot of repackaging for her own purposes. 1, it can't be too short and it can't be too long, or you'd forget all the clues. 2, there's a hero or heroine. The virtue of the detective trumps the vice of the criminal. So the detective has to be someone you would be rooting for. 3, crime must be resolved in a believable manner. The sort that would inspire the reader to say, "Oh, I should have known it was her." And now a couple different ways you can resolve it, and she goes into that. I won't now. 4, the author must be trustworthy. If he says that Mary arrived home at 10, she must have arrived home at 10. But if he says the clock struck 10, well, that's a witness of the clock, not the author. And the clock can be a little bit messed up. Point 5, and this is a big one. The author must abide by fair play, which means he cannot withhold evidence. At the same time, it's the author's job to mislead, to make the obvious suspect innocent and the innocent party suspect, and so on and so forth, and kind of to play with reader's mind. He just cannot give false information. So how do you play with a reader's mind? Well, the primary tool, she says, provided by Aristotle is something called paralogismos, or the false syllogism. Now, paralogismos, Dorothy Sayers, should be written up in letters of gold on every mystery monger's study. It is at once the guiding star by which he sets his compass and the jack-o'-lantern by which he leads his readers into the bog. So the paralogismos, false syllogism, goes a little something like this. The servant Jones is heard to say to his lord, Master Smith. Let me back up. The servant Jones is heard to say to his lord, Master Smith, "Very good, my lord." Reader composes the following syllogism. Jones is speaking to Smith. Jones only speaks to someone alive. Therefore, Smith must be alive. So that's a pattern of thought that the reader is following. But there are problems. Jones might be speaking to a corpse, or maybe Jones has recorded his voice. So this leads to double bluffs, double agents, and so on. If you have seen the movie Princess Bride, you've seen the scene with iocane powder. And he puts, the guy is like switching the cups, and he says, never argue with a Sicilian when death is on the line. And anyway, that's not really relevant. They switch the cups, and the hero says, I'm putting iocane powder in one, and, whichever one drinks it will die, and the other one will get to survive. Well, iocane powder is very, very poisonous in the story. And of course, the hero, what the Sicilian doesn't realize is that the hero has built up an immunity to iocane powder. So the Sicilian has formed this syllogism, this pattern of thought that is, iocane powder is in his cup. Iocane powder is poisonous. Therefore, he'll be poisoned by the iocane powder, which is a paralogismos, according to Aristotle and Sayers. There you go. New word. Lots to take in on this episode. You can just get whatever nuggets you want from it. But since she didn't write a textbook on writing, it's probably better just to kind of pick and choose some things that she said and leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of the Dorothy L. Sayers podcast, Advice on Writing. I'm Lindsay Ann Scholl, and you can find more writing on my blog, www.lindsayannScholl.com. And I hope you have a great day. Pax vobiscum. Peace be with you.